I still see we have some folks logging on, but I want to welcome you all to today's meeting. I know that for the work group members, we've had some very informative readings and a video that we have hopefully been able to consume prior to today's meeting as well. I do recognize our co-chair of our larger task force, Associate Justice Earls. Ma'am, do you have anything for us today?
Not today, thank you. Just want to thank the work group members and the presenters for all your great work. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Always good to have you, and your insights, direction, and correction is always welcome. I do want to I've heard from one other working group member, Sheriff Clemens just called me a little while ago. He is tied up with some business with the Sheriff's Association, some important business there as well. But he did want me to make sure that he passed on his regards to everyone and is still a vital part of this work that we're doing, knowing that everyone's busy. I'm actually here at the Emergency Operations Center. We're in day 197 of our state activation under a state of emergency for COVID-19. And so I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Welty in just a minute, and then I'm going to mute my camera and then transition to another room, hopefully in a minute or so. And so I hope that we don't have any audio issues on the front part of it. So we're going to dive right in. I'd also like to welcome, I see that we have Chief Smythe from Burlington, who is going to be a participant. Thank you, Chief, for joining us. And he's going to be available to lend some insights into our discussion later on for community policing. And so we look forward to those insights as well. So right now, and forgive me if I mute my camera, I haven't left you. I'm just going to try to transition to a more suitable room out here at the Emergency Operations Center. I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Welty, and we're going to start our meeting by reviewing the revised recommendations on use of force and SROs. And so I'll turn it over to Learned Counsel, Mr. Welty.
All right, thank you, Secretary Hooks, and good afternoon, members of the working group. I think everybody should have received in the email materials that Greg sent out our revised draft recommendations on use of force and SROs. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but we have been down the road a bit with each of these already and have had some significant discussion about each one. What we tried to do as a staff between last meeting and this meeting was to revise those recommendations in a way that met as many as possible of the comments and concerns that working group members identified, and to be really, really clear about what we were doing. So if you've seen the document, you see that text that used to be in there but is proposed for removal is struck through, but you can still see exactly what's being removed. New text is underlined so that you can see exactly what's proposed to be added. And there's a comment for most or all of the recommendations indicating what we did and why, if we did anything. The plan for today is to talk about any of these that folks want to talk further about. I think we're fairly close on most of them, but there may be some that people still wish to discuss, and that's of course fine. We ultimately, at the end of our last meeting, took sort of an informal vote, I guess I would say. After this meeting, if we need to make any additional changes, we'll do that in consultation with Secretary Hooks, and then we will send these out for an official up or down vote, which will be conducted electronically between this meeting and our next meeting. I think the concept at that point is they'll be as good as we can make them, and we just need to vote to approve them or not, understanding that in any collaborative process like this, they might not be, people may still have outstanding concerns, but just kind of need to take them or leave them at that point as they are. So rather than go through each recommendation individually and explain what we did, I thought I would just kind of hit a couple of high points, and then if there are questions about how we approached any of the recommendations, I'm happy to address them. So the couple of high points that I wanted to call out: on use of force, the Sentinel Event Review recommendation is, as you will recall, very detailed, and it's a collaborative recommendation, we hope, with working group 1, which is also looking at it from an accountability standpoint. There have been some changes to the draft intended to meet some of the concerns of members of this working group. And when we send the recommendations out for a vote, we can send the current draft along with that so folks can take a look at it. There are some thorny problems there, and I'm not sure that every problem will be fully resolved even by the time of our vote, but we're definitely headed in a positive direction. The data collection recommendations, we kind of combined them to require both state and federal level data collection consistent with what some of the discussion was. You can see what we did with the quote unquote suicide by cop recommendation as well. The recommendation regarding hog tying subjects, we added a definition there that folks may want to take a look at. That's kind of what we understood to be the accepted understanding of that practice, right? Sergeant Garton referenced kind of connecting anything to the hand restraints, the handcuffs. It seemed like the kind of common understanding for a hog tie is that it was behind the back. So we added that, but we can address that further if folks would like to do that. And then on the SROs, we had fewer changes. I think we added some specificity about data collection in the direction of what Mr. Wells had been advocating for. And I think one thing that folks might want to look at there is item 5, the inclusive processes for selecting and overseeing SROs. There was some discussion there about whether communities should use advisory boards or not, and we kind of massaged that language to indicate that that was an option some communities may want to consider. So that's kind of an overview of where we're at this point. I'm happy to answer any questions about what we did with the recommendations and why, or if there's remaining concerns, to hear what those may be.
Thank you, Jeff. Do any of the work group members have any particular questions of Jeff or any specific concerns or need any additional clarification?
Yes, this is Kerwin Pittman. Good evening, everybody. I have remaining concerns for particularly the Sentinel event review, and particularly the lack of transparency and accountability when it comes. So I particularly, as I commented last week, had an issue with kind of, and I don't have the recommendation right in front of my face, so I'm kind of paraphrasing, but kind of shielding law enforcement from any type of civil litigation or criminal litigation if it is deemed that they have violated any type of policies or laws egregiously. And my only concern is, as a task force to combat racial inequities within the criminal justice system, it seemed like for this provision to be added that we are shielding these bad apples from true accountability and shielding the public from transparency, if that is the charge pretty much of this task force, which is only reinforcing the racial inequities within the criminal justice system and not really focusing on addressing the actual problem and taking care of the problems and finding solutions for the problem. So that was my issue with the Sentinel event review, as well as for it to be searchable in an organized manner for the public. That wasn't added into it as well. And so we always want to have that gift of transparency, if possible, for the community, especially in nowadays in time with law enforcement and community engagement. So we always want to keep that in mind and at the forefront of our thoughts. And so for the Sentinel event review, that was one. For the data collection, I also had commented about putting in the same type of specification, being that it may be some type of searchable body of work that we can look at via like computer or something for individuals in the community to kind of see transparency of what's going on with this data collection. It's good to collect data, but if the community is not abreast to the data in which we're collecting, it's kind of a moot point for the lack of transparency and combating racial inequities within the criminal justice system. And so I have a few more comments, but I'll let somebody else go. But those was specifically the two that jumped out at me the most.
Thank
Can
you,
I-
Mr. Pittman. Yes, I'll let, was that Ms. McGee?
I just wanted to jump in and say, since Ellen and I have the pen on the Sentinel event review draft, that we did make the change regarding the public searchability before it was passed on to Working Group 1. And we didn't have a full consensus on where folks wanted to go regarding civil liability, but it was clear that there was interest in that issue. And so it just seems to me to still be an open question. There are two issues. One is, how do you get people to participate in the Sentinel event review, and whether you make that mandatory or not? And if it's not mandatory, sort of the civil liability is not making civil liability an issue is one way you encourage people to participate. And then there's a separate issue of sort of whether you should be able to use the information as a general matter. So I just wanted to flag that and just say that this is not the totality of what accountability recommendations might come out of this task force. Working Group 1, the reason they're looking at it is because they have the issue of accountability. And so how to handle criminal investigations, how to handle civil litigation, all of those are still to be discussed. And so this is not our only bite at that apple. So I just wanted to provide that context in terms of what the other working group is looking at.
I think that's good background. And just to add to that, my understanding based on our conversations over the last couple of months was that this Sentinel event review process was post criminal investigation, post civil issues. And it was focused on ways to improve and really looking deeper at how to either put into context, prevent, or something along those lines. So I think if there is to be a criminal investigation, that clearly has to go first. And that has to be complete and comprehensive and follow all the normal protocols. And I think the conversation around these Sentinel event reviews were more to align them like the FAA does for plane crashes and so on, and what the medical profession does for malpractice, things like that. So and those are set up much like my understanding of this is, which is focused really on prevention and improvement, not on liability. Is that a fair understanding of, for those of you who know more about this?
And the current draft does say after criminal investigation is complete, and it says preferably after a civil litigation. I understand that there's a little tension there because of the potential delay, but you know, if it's resolved, then I think it speaks to both issues, right? Because it hasn't affected the civil case at all, which I think everybody. Maybe not everybody agrees, but like that's kind of what we're talking about here, sort of what should be able to be used from this review.
It's my understanding that the Sentinel review is more for a process of the department to kind of say, what could we have done better? And I think there's enough.
Dorian.
When it comes to criminal investigation and liability assessment, and when we start speaking about officer involved shootings, for example, and again, and I know I say this a lot, but I'm only speaking for the Raleigh Police Department. You're talking about 3 separate investigations ongoing, one from the SBI, one from our Internal Affairs Unit, and one from our assault unit, or if there's a homicide, then the homicide unit takes it over. You're talking about 3 investigations, all trying to assign fault or blame to whatever the facts lead us. I think we would do a disservice if we don't open at some point an investigation that just figures out how this happens without trying to assign a fault or a blame, but a way or path to kind of prevent it in the future, regardless of who holds the liability in the situation. And I think that was and I'll have to agree with the Chief Letney here. I think that was the purpose of the Sentinel review to start with. If there's a liability to be had or a criminal investigation or charges to be made, I think there are several avenues of investigation that handle that. And I think even if in those incidents where officers have been found to be in the wrong, I think a sentinel review would still be able to benefit the department and further law enforcement agencies to just have a complete and open dialogue about what took place without fear of not being able to speak for fear of some type of civil litigation. At some point, we have to get to the point of the process to how did this happen? Why did it happen? How can we prevent it from happening again, no matter who's at fault? And I think there's enough investigations and enough looking into to kind of determine that without also tacking on the sentinel review as another fact or another fault finding investigation rather than just an open investigation to kind of get to the meats and potatoes of the incident.
I'll try again. I'm concerned because good afternoon, everyone. There needs to be more transparency for Deborah and John Q. Public. And the Sentinel Review provides one of those aspects. You say, and the thing is, you said fault finding, but it's not fault finding, it's fact finding. Just like a child fatality report, which is done a year after when a child in North Carolina dies. Is not to find fault, but to find fact so that you can correct whatever happened in that particular case so it does not happen again. Where did we go, but not trying to find fault, and then finding out if there are positives that happened, that this person did something else. It's not always, you gotta look at both sides of the picture, but the public truly needs this. And while I'm speaking, I encourage all of you to go to PBS because they're doing specials about community policing. And right now they're focusing on Baltimore and you can stream it. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
And I agree that it should be open to the public. That wasn't my standpoint. My standpoint was that if we're looking for the true facts, and anytime we attach liability to it, departments all across the country are going to be more resistant or more reluctant to release those facts as they relate, just simply because they're going to be tied up in some type of civil litigation if they start to lay all the facts out. So I think we got to have some kind of investigation that allows them to do that without fear of being held even more civilly liable for just releasing the facts.
This is Angelica. I think it is a complex issue, and I think just want to underscore that the concern for me is if we do create a venue that someone along has interpreted that, oh, if I participate in this, then I'm possibly exposing myself to civil liability. I think that that's really going to curb down participation. And I also think that that's not, I feel that all the parties in participation with the Sentinel reviews should really come to the place of, this isn't necessarily of, it's about looking at an incident and dissecting it and being able to find what could have been done differently, also to be able to help identify systematic issues that could possibly arise or that could be identified. But it's also to identify what went right. So I just want to make sure that, like, in the way that we proceed, because if we're already coming at it from a perspective of, I might be held liable depending on what comes out, I don't think it's going to permit for as much vulnerability and, being able to come to the table with as many facts, or I would argue all the facts with regards to an incident. And also, having said that, it's the issue of time too. My concern is how do we balance that out of being able to sit down and really review an incident, and yet in a timely basis, and one that is steeped in transparency as well, because I do think transparency is part of the equation.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all work group members for your perspectives on that. I do want to remind everyone, just as was stated by Jasmine McGee, there is another working group that's fully tasked with police accountability. So this kind of more or less lends itself to the departments or offices having a policy or a mindset toward openness for Sentinel review, be it recommendation, be it a requirement, be it legislation. You can look at it from a variety of ways. And from the perspective that I have, I've never took it to be a replacement for any of the other venues. There is, if there's a criminal investigation that would take place, an internal affairs investigation, theoretically training and standards would also take that up as well. Civil litigation is still open and available as a possible remedy if that is the case. And then the Sentinel review is value added to all of those things. So we're talking about adding something into the whole scope of additional steps to of community relations, recognizing professional conduct, abating less than professional conduct as well. So, and all of the points, and I won't rehash all of those, but there are going to be certain bars to trying to make the Sentinel review the forefront of the investigation, because no attorney is going to allow their client in a civil or a criminal case to go out there and further jeopardize themselves. And that may be whether it's the citizen who was out there, who's the officer who was involved, or civil litigation down the road. And we want to promote openness. So we have to make sure that that we look at it as a venue, as Ms. Nguyen said, to get to some fuller disclosures, but not intrude upon those, because we could try to do something to make it so open that everybody sees everything, and then it may preclude things from moving forward in perhaps a criminal case or a civil case. And so there are a lot of things to discuss, but overall, I do want us to kind of refocus on the idea that there's another work group that's taking up police accountability, but policy is certainly a part of that. And so I'm going to kick it back to Jeff or to Jasmine, who have been working with the working groups, about what you've heard. Very legitimate concerns, great discussion, but I wanted to see if you had any additional context to add from your backgrounds and legal experience.
I agree with your sentiment, Secretary Hooks, that if liability could attach to these reviews, given that there's no authority to compel anyone to participate in them, I think participation will be very low. I guess the only other thing I would say is the models that we have for Sentinel event reviews coming out of the aviation and medical fields say that a non-blaming, forward-looking approach is central to the concept of a Sentinel event review. So if there isn't an appetite to do something structured in that way, then it just isn't a Sentinel event review at all. That concept, as it's come to be understood, is by its nature non-blaming. There's plenty of other processes, as you noted, that come with the potential for liability, but that's it's central to this concept. So I think removing it would really be challenging from a perspective of, our model. Our path that's been blazed in this area really takes as central that it has to be a non-blaming process. So that's the only additional thought that I have about that.
Thank you, sir. And I am amazed with these great discussion where the time goes to. So I want to pivot over to SROs. Jeff, did you have any more to add concerning the draft recommendation for SROs? So I can let the group weigh in on any lingering issues or things stirring in their spirit concerning SROs.
Nothing further from me. Thank you.
Does anybody have any additional that they would like to weigh in concerning SROs that's appropriate to take up at this point. And don't feel bad that we spent this time on use of force and Sentinel reviews. It's really at the heart of what community concerns are about use of force. And so we certainly understand that. I just want to make sure that we keep things moving, recognizing that our work group recommendations go on to the larger task force. You're still full members of the larger task force, and there will be future opportunities to be heard and work through these as well. You do not lose your voice when the working group pushes something forward. You still have that place with the larger task force. I'd like to open it up concerning SROs in any of the information or draft recommendations, proposals that hopefully we'll get to the point that we can do the voting on. I like to do that at this time.
Again, this is Kerwin Pittman. If nobody, I jump right in and get set it off again. So in regards to SROs within the schools, though our recommendations are great, I hope that we continue to build upon these recommendations, and this is not the be all end all, which I know it would not be. So I particularly have an issue with advisory boards being took out of the process for develop inclusion process for selecting and overseeing SROs. I particularly like that advisory board perspective because I want to leave particular schools and communities that option to create some type of accountability board. So within our recommendations, I really do not see, to be all the way honest with you, some type of check and balance for the SROs, like an advisory board or some type of committee that oversees them to make sure that the work within that particular school fits the model of individuals not being biased towards the students of that school. So I would like kind of our recommendations to kind of reflect, or please refresh me if I'm missing something, if our recommendations might do reflect this accountability piece right now, as far as with SROs, or not only an accountability piece, but just something to equalizer of the playing field to ensure that SROs are not specifically targeting individuals who are within the particular schools and funneling the school to poverty, the school to prison pipeline, the poverty to prison pipeline within the school system. And so that particular piece about the advisory board, as well as and correct me if I'm wrong, the lack of some type of equalizer for the SROs.
All right, I'll start, but I'll turn back over to Jeff and Jasmine, because I know Jasmine's been working with the accountability work group as well. As I read it, it does not bar the municipality or sheriff's office, if they so choose, to have advisory boards. But I do recognize the specific language is not there. And so I believe, and I don't have it right in front of me at this particular second, but that tool certainly could be, if that's what's best for that community, an advisory board. That tool could be the city council or some oversight that they have, or bringing somebody into that process. There are also tools that are available, because these SRO positions are done in conjunction with the schools, that there are entities out there such as the Center for Safer Schools, the Safer Schools Task Force, the Department of Public Instruction, who is another North Carolina entity that could look at those as well and set up those structures as part of the MOUs with the law enforcement agencies. We also, and I know Sheriff Clemens isn't on, also, in my mind, leave it a little broad, because the elected office of the High Sheriff of all 100 counties is a constitutional office. And so I would defer to the attorneys about oversight advisory boards, whereas it relates to a constitutionally elected office of the sheriff. And so with that, I'll ask Jasmine or Jeff to weigh in on their perspectives.
Would it be helpful? I'm wondering if it'd be, I think Greg's about to do this, but I think it might be helpful to look at the language regarding advisory boards because they weren't removed. We just kind of revised the recommendation to make clear that they're not the only possible tool a community can use to monitor and provide feedback on SROs. That they might be the right choice for some communities. Other communities might use different tools, but we've left the language that inclusive tools should be used and just, I think, clarified that advisory boards are one option for that, but they're not necessarily the only option for that. So there was some kind of mixed discussion of advisory boards, and it led us in the direction of let's flag it as an option for communities, but also acknowledge that different communities, different sheriffs, different chiefs, different school systems might use different tools. So that's, thanks, Greg, for putting that up, but that's where the language stands.
That's outstanding. I was looking at a previous draft from what I saw earlier. Mr. Pittman, with the recognition, what's in there under 5, does that alleviate some of the concern around that? And then after he quickly answers, I want to turn to other members for any perspective they have.
Yes, that alleviates it because it gives it still the option for it to be utilized within that particular community if they choose so.
Thank you, sir. Do we have any weigh in from any of the other members of the work group? Okay, hearing none, I am going to, oh, I'm sorry, did I miss someone?
Yes, sir. How are you, Secretary Hooks?
Fine. Hi, Ms.
I'm a little challenged, but I'm here today. I think the part about the advisory, while in itself was good, every time I start a meeting, I give people what my mission statement is. And the SROs need to be very clear what their roles and responsibilities are whenever they walk in the door repeatedly, because some people forget what my mission is. And I think, I'm not saying put that in there, but it seems that that's part of why we're here, because most of the school systems have forgotten.
Yes, ma'am. Point well taken, and it also is good for all of us to hear, and many of the working groups are going to hear some similar information. I am aware that Deputy Secretary Billy Lassiter and perhaps Judge Corpening will be addressing one of the other work groups too as well, and SROs are a factor in what's going to be unveiled to those other work groups. So I think that gives us some great synergy to recognize that for those systems that utilize SROs, that both for training for SROs and also training for staff and administrators and the public and parents and students alike about what the proper use of SROs. And that's where we can rely on other entities such as DPI and the Governor's Task Force for Safer Schools are taking up that mantle. In fact, they've already had that mantle in there. And I'm not punting our responsibilities. I'm just letting you know that there are people that have had experts on this for months and maybe a year now with a Safer Schools initiative that can advance this cause. And so for me, if we put it in the context, and I have asked them to go back even with the proposed draft for the state action plan for school safety, to that they go back through and look at this through a racial equity lens, so that they not only just unveil a solid plan that promotes safety and security, addresses anti-bullying, no doubt brings in the idea and concepts of psychologists and counselors into the mix in a healthy way, and with the idea that SROs do no harm. And they've been great upon that work, but I've challenged that Governor's Task Force and those members over there to go back through their proposed recommendations, which are out for public comment right now, to look at, again, through a racial equity lens and clarify that we want these equities as a part of that.
And Secretary Hooks, if I may, just a drafting note that we did have that conversation and about sort of the need to state more clearly what the purpose of SROs were. And we slowed down just because we wanted to make sure that we weren't putting anything in there that was inconsistent with those other entities, and including the Justice Academy and their training. And so that's not to say all of those definitions couldn't change, but it was something that was discussed. And I think we intended to at some point go back to once we could be sure we were being consistent.
Right, and I know there may be members that may not have as much familiarity with the Task Force for Safer Schools, and I'll work with our administrative leads to maybe push a link or two to you concerning that, so that you know the other work that's going on through other entities, and how we can play a major role into that, but also recognizing that they're down the road on these issues, and knowing that I have charged them with looking through it through the racial equity lens, and that it's not a DPS entity, it's actually staffed by the Department of Public Instruction, but I've utilized my role in the fact that Deputy Secretary Lassiter is the current chairman of the Task Force for Safer Schools, to bring the thought and the energy from this group to that entity as well. So I want to turn it back over to any of the other task force members before I ask both either Jeff or Greg to weigh in about the prospect of voting and how we would achieve that, just so you'll know what the process will be.
Yes, I'd like to jump in right quick and ask if possible, the administrative leads could send some type of link from working group. I believe is one that's dealing with accountability, to see kind of what juxtaposed with our topics, and kind of take a view at both of them, so we will kind of be abreast to know what's going on within the other working group as well, or it may already be posted. But if not, please refresh. If it had, please refresh my memory. If not, if you could please provide that, it'd be greatly appreciated.
Not yet. There will be 2 accountability days for working group 1. They have not had them yet. The first one is October 1st. And so that will be in the normal email that you all get, with sort of like what the working group schedules are for the week and what the topics will be. But we'll get with substantive staff lead Leslie Cooley-Dismukes to get more detail that we can share with you all.
Greg or Jeff, could you kind of give us an idea of how you envision of us moving forward with the particular voting process for these recommendations?
Yeah, I think what we'll do, it seems like we're in pretty good shape with the recommendations, but we'll take a last pass and make sure whether we need to do any last revisions. And then we'll get a clean version out to the group to vote on electronically by like a doodle poll or something similar to that, SurveyMonkey, and that will actually be the up or down vote on those. One other part of the process that I thought would be appropriate to share now is that as we move from these recommendations into kind of a full presentation of the recommendations with some context and the reason for them and the objective of the recommendations, there will be some additional drafting about what we identified as kind of the problem to be solved, what the goal of the recommendations is. A lot of that drafting is going to be spread around amongst several members of the staff, because I think it'll be fairly substantial. Our vision is to mostly handle that invisibly. If there's specific things that we need to come back to the group on in order to make sure that we're fairly reflecting the discussion of the group, we can do that. I think there'll probably be some opportunity for folks to look at it at some point, but I just wanted to share that some of the kind of context for the recommendations and so forth is stuff that we will draft up to go around it once we've actually voted on the recommendations themselves. Greg, did I say anything wrong, or was I missing anything important?
That's correct, and they will be circulated to the group in the same way that you received a survey from Ellen with Working Group 3's recommendations, where it has the full context of the problem statement and the vision for a future state for review.
All right, thank you. I'm going to move us further along on the agenda, and we're going to go to, is listed as what I have as agenda item 3, review recommendations on diversion and reinventing public safety. Do we have those draft recommendations that can be put on the screen, Greg? And I'd like everyone to take a read and test their recollections and also lend their perspectives in light of a number of things, because these are not separate and apart from community policing, which we have on our agenda as well. It's certainly a part of the larger whole. And so I'd like for us to look at these through what we already have brought to the table, what we have learned in the readings that have been provided to us, and the video that we saw concerning the community discussions at the barbershop. And I'll go back to our administrative leads to touch on any highlights that they would like to think that they think that needs to be particularly focused on. I do see some staff notes in here.
The one thing that I would say, I think with regard to reinventing public safety, it pretty much speaks for itself, and it tries to encompass several of the strategies that we discussed as a working group. But there seemed to be some recognition that different communities would have different resources and preferences. So we tried to highlight the overall goal of decentering police and responding to some of these issues while acknowledging that there might be different ways to do that. The diversion recommendation, I did want to say one thing about. We had some information about diversion that Melissa Larson from the North Carolina Harm Reduction Coalition presented at our last meeting. We had some readings about diversion. We didn't have a ton of discussion about diversion. I just wanted to refresh everybody that they received from Greg an email with kind of a write-up providing some context for thinking about diversion, and particularly thinking about it as broader than opioids, which has been the main focus of lead diversion, and thinking about diversion in a racial equity lens. That was written by the Policy Council at NCDOJ, and I think, at least in general terms, has the blessing of the co-chairs as an approach. That's provided just to be kind of grist for the mill and thinking about diversion, which the co-chairs have identified as a priority area for them. So we did this recommendation, we drafted this recommendation based in part on our discussion as a working group, but also based in part on that additional feedback. So there's some context there, but of course, like any draft recommendation, it's ultimately for the working group to decide what it wants to do with it, if anything. So that's kind of the backstory of how these got drafted. And with that, I think that's about all the staff level context we can offer.
Thank you, sir. And so I would like to open it up to our working group members. I know that they're drawn broadly, but recognizing the various capabilities and sizes of agencies, support within those communities, and also cost of diversion programs or law enforcement-led diversions. I'd like to open it up to our working group members to weigh in concerning their thoughts. Is this overly broad? Do you have some granular suggestions? We also have the benefit of having Chief Smythe here with us. I know he's on tap for the for community policing, but I don't think we can really separate those two. So I would welcome him, and I will really maybe combine 3 and 4 together for purposes of this discussion. Does anybody like to go up first?
Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir, Chief Letney.
Thank you. Regarding I'll start with the diversion recommendation. Well, I think diversion is a great thing to have in our toolbox. It is appropriate in many circumstances, many others it may not be. My only concern with this recommendation is not in the recommendation itself, but in the structure, in the development. So it says law enforcement agencies should establish pre-arrest diversion programs. I don't think it's a responsibility of law enforcement. I think law enforcement should absolutely be at the table and be a partner, but a lot of what we've talked about is the societal problems, the failures of other systems that result in these issues being laid at the feet of the police to solve. We are not the experts in any diversion program. We may be the entry. So I think it's very important to have the law enforcement voice at the table and that partnership and collaboration to make it work. But each community is going to be different, and I don't think a law enforcement agency is skilled, equipped, or staffed to be establishing programs. It depends way too much on what resources are available in that community as to how a program is going to be structured. And that's going to be different throughout the state, as we've talked about in other things. So while the goal is great, I would ask that we revise the responsibility and put it where it can actually have some traction and not lay it at the feet of law enforcement.
Well taken, Chief. So perhaps it certainly is broader than law enforcement. And so if anyone has any additional recommendations concerning whether we add agencies or entities such as social services, mental health professionals, it also requires the buy-in of district attorneys across the state, because diversion in and of itself may mean a recognition that there may have been a violation of the law, and then a department or officers using some discretion, it's either authorized or inherent discretion, to not treat that as an arrest situation and be the entry point into the criminal justice system. But that has to be sanctioned by prosecutors in that area, lest you give rise to the specter of you let Eric Hooks go because he looked like this, but you didn't let John Letney go because he looked like this. And so we want to make sure that we have buy-in for all communities, or that you can maybe make the decision of not making that duress, but that doesn't automatically mean that social services or mental health is going to take up that person's issue to get you the help they need. So I don't have the specific wording in front of me, but I invite working group members to weigh in concerning that.
Yes, this is Kerwin Pittman. So I got a couple points on diversion. And though I agree with Chief Letney's, was that me? I'm sorry.
You're good, sir. We can hear you if you want to go on. I don't know, you may have been frozen.
It looks frozen.
Okay, we'll come back to Mr. Pittman. Any of the other working group members have a perspective or an idea that could move us forward?
This is Angelica. I'm not sure if this is where Kerwin was going, but I'm curious because when we talk about the law enforcement assisted diversion programs, or what we had been reading, one of the communities up north had indicated that they were not very successful in it, and one of the reasons was because many reasons was because there wasn't law enforcement buy-in. And so for me, if it's not, I'm curious I'm curious as to whether, if a law enforcement agency is the conduit to developing the diversion program, if that would impact the buy-in less than if you have another agency like social services. Like, would there be more buy-in by law enforcement officers if it was led by a law enforcement agency?
I'm going to invite Sergeant Garton to lend his perspective to that. And Chief Smythe, I'm going to let you in this conversation if you're available to lend your experience and wisdom in this area too as well.
Mr. Secretary, I think when we start talking about diversion as a program and then buy-in from law enforcement, one of the things I think, if the law enforcement agency obviously has developed the diversion program, 9 times out of 10, there's going to be some level of mandating that it be participated with. I guess where my confusion lies is, are we talking diversion as it relates to criminal charges, or on the same level as diversion as it relates to like a mental health issue? Because then I think what we start running into in either case is resources. And what are the resources that apply to the diversion? A lot of times law enforcement officers really break it down into what is best for the participant and what is the most immediate or the expedient way to handle this particular call, so I can move on to this next call requiring my assistance. And so as it relates to buy-in from the departments or from police officers on the street, I think it really boils down to a means of resources and the availability of those resources, be it a diversion program or not. If that diversion program, in essence, creates more work, you're going to have less buy-in, if that makes sense.
It does, sir. I think that it means different things in different communities, and anybody feel free to jump in and disagree as well, because diversion also, there's referral, because police may be called into an instant and say, this is really not a policing matter beyond ensuring that public safety is there. So there's that referral that may be taken up by other entities. Diversion is diverting them away from the criminal justice system, which there's some of that with referring so that it doesn't escalate or lend itself to being perceived as criminal activity. It could be as granular as a mother stealing something from a store, and you recognize that she's done it because her kids are hungry. And so exercising that authority to not arrest and to get them the type of services they need, that could be looked at as a diverting away from the criminal justice system and getting help to meet that person's need in the community. But there are many other examples. And so I would open it up to other task force members to weigh in, and feel free to disagree.
Yes, it's Kerwin Pittman. I'm back. I apologize. I was having some type of technical issues. So to kind of elevate Chief Letney's perspective of law enforcement not particularly being equipped to handle diversion, but we know and understand that they are the gatekeepers. Hands down, they are the gatekeepers to enter this system. And so if individuals within any particular community lack the resources, I feel we should put some type of recommendation that we obtain some type of resources, via from the state, federal level, county level, for individuals to particularly practice diversion programs and implement these in place, as well as we create some type of board, committee, or something to where we bring all the equitable pieces to the table, be it DA, law enforcement, community members, to try to hash out different diversion tactics that may work in their particular geographic location. But no one understand that law enforcement, though it is not their job to be social workers right now, the issue is at their feet. And so we must address that issue that's currently at their feet and alleviate some of that stress from them, but as well as get them to buy into the diversion program or diversions period. And so finances will be one way to alleviate the stress for them not to buy into it. And that's kind of my thoughts on that for right now.
Thank you, sir. Any other working group meetings? And I'm drafting Chief Smythe into this today as well for any perspective he might like to add to this portion of it.
Secretary Hooks?
Yes, ma'am.
Law enforcement will most likely be a part of whatever diversion program is. And one other part that was not mentioned is the magistrates who place charges on individuals. I challenge the state of North Carolina to put the same energy they put into lead programs that stop Caucasian offenders from going to jail or serving time into making some sort of diversion program that'll benefit people of color and marginalized people in the same type of standard or usage. And then we can have a reduction. I believe our late judge in Brunswick had a drug court as a diversion, and that was before the opioid crisis, Judge Lewis. We have teen court diversions for teenagers. Let us have something for the average person who looks like me, who accidentally has to do something that they should not have had gone to jail for because they were charged. And that's what a diversion program, I believe, is supposed to do. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate those thoughts. I know that Judge Lewis left quite a legacy as well. And so point very well taken, because we have to make sure that as a working group, we continue to look through things through a racial equity lens. And to be quite frank, that there are as many of the great initiatives that have come out concerning opioids, that some of that same thought process has not extended over to minority communities. And that's just the fact of the matter. I welcome input from anyone else.
Secretary Hooks, if I might just briefly, the document that Greg has shared is the document that I mentioned earlier that was sent around, not in the agenda with the email and other materials, but subsequent to that, that was drafted by Policy Council here at NCDOJ. And I think it provides some context that speaks to what some of folks are thinking about here. In particular, it draws a connection between a broader effort at diversion that isn't so focused on opioids and racial equity. And I think Ms. Maxwell is just right in hitting on the idea that the law enforcement assisted diversion, as we think of it these days, is focused on people who are drug addicts and specifically opioid addicts. And it comes with a lot of potential for treatment in the community and other interventions designed to address drug use. But really, if you take a step back, diversion is any kind of program that involves officers choosing not to make an arrest and instead do something else with the person who may have violated the law, but for whom criminal justice system involvement isn't the right solution. And that can mean things like teen court. It can mean things for low-level offenders of all kinds that may involve some community service or getting education or services. So there's a huge array of potential solutions here, and many of them really could focus on racial equity more than some of the current models of diversion do. So I think this document provides some context for that broader thinking. And the recommendation, as we had initially drafted it, and maybe we should revise it, but the recommendation was intended to capture that broader sense of diversion, that diversion could mean different things in different places and could be quite a lot more encompassing than the lead model that that has attracted a lot of attention so far. So you can see, I think Greg's scrolling through the document a little bit, but some of the ways to do that would be to systematically collect data on who participates in diversion programs, to make sure that folks who are involved in the diversion programs have appropriate training, to make sure that there's a lot of different ways to enter the diversion program. So if it's helpful, that's some of the background that we were thinking about. And I think it does, it gets to some of the points that members of the working group are making. I don't know how or what extent to incorporate anything like that within the recommendation itself, but I just offer that as part of the context that we were looking at and thinking about as we approach the drafting process.
Thank you, sir. That is
Secretary.
Helpful. Chief?
This is very helpful, and I think the conversation brings up the fact that while law enforcement is the gatekeeper, if we're talking about law enforcement assisted diversion, and that's a good program, but I think we also have to look in the context of how and why that was started, particularly in the Northeast, and it had to do with the fact that nobody else was doing it, and law enforcement was going back to dealing with the same person over and over and over again, and there was no solution. There was no help being offered to this person who was maybe breaking into cars or breaking into homes or panhandling or something like that. And so kind of almost as a self-preservation method, the law enforcement had to find a better way. And there wasn't easy access into treatment. So they found a way, and they made a way through law enforcement, which got persons a proper treatment, and then as part of that, reduced crime. So a good result there. But that's one way. And while it's an effective way in that circumstance, and I think we need to research it, we also need to have, as Mr. Welty said, different pathways. There needs to be other off-ramps from the criminal justice system, because the law enforcement agency either may not have the ability to divert, or there may not be something in that particular community to divert to. And so the only choice, or the best choice, maybe in their mind at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, is to charge someone to take them to jail. But there can be other off-ramps. It can be the magistrate. It can be the district court judge. It can be the court system itself. It can be probation, that would have access to maybe more options, maybe better ways to divert, that street police officer doesn't have at his or her fingertips. So the many off-ramp conversation like we had a few weeks ago, I think very much fits here and should be part of us looking at an overall diversion program for where it's appropriate for all persons, not just, teens and drug court and that kind of thing, as Ms. Maxwell had said.
Secretary Hooks, if I may, just a couple of drafting and overlap notes. Working Group 3 does have a recommendation that is looking at this issue as well, and it does mention multiple system actors. And so I could see that being combined with whatever this ends up being. So I just wanted to flag that. And then the sequential intercept model and this whole concept of diverting people wherever it exists along the spectrum is also mentioned in this document. And finally, that Steve Mange, who put this document together, is frantically texting me, wanting me to let you all know that this absolutely should be something that is done in collaboration with partners. Law enforcement should be at the table, but it need not say law enforcement should collaborate with insert parties here and then continue on the rest of the language. So I think that that's a drafting note that we can absolutely make.
Thank you. I appreciate it. We're going to rely on Mr. Welty and Ms. McGee to bring that together in greater focus for us. Chief Smythe, I'm drafting you into this discussion a little earlier than anticipated, and then we'll come back and reset with Jeff Welty to kind of open the door to what is listed as our fourth focus today for community policing. But Chief, you've been listening to these great discussions from these fine folks on here. So I open the door to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm honored to be present. Thank you for the invitation. In the early part of this discussion, I was forming some remarks in my head, and it was circling around primarily juvenile diversion. So I'll kind of spend some time talking about that. I think, I got to North Carolina 7 years ago and was introduced to the JCPC concept. And so we've got the juvenile crime prevention commissions around the state. And I cry foul just a little bit because they're really not about juvenile crime prevention. We deal only with actors that are involved in the system primarily. We're not really out in front of this preventing crime, but that's a different drum to beat. But within that group, then I've been exposed to these cross-impact actors, right? And a year and a half ago, I brought together folks in my community. We were looking at doing a grant for diversion stuff and recognized that we wanted to include racial equity in the grant. So I now have a grant from the Governor's Crime Commission that's going to pay for a 2-day racial equity institute for juvenile crime counselors or DJJ counselors, school principals. When you roll this in with SROs, right, you get this kind of holistic approach of everybody who's dealing with these youth. And if everybody has this racial equity lens, all then looking towards collaborative diversion, I feel like we can really help a lot of kids that never, ever have to get into the system. If we're talking about capping off the school to prison pipeline, in my mindset, this is the way to do that. And so I just hold out that tap into the JCPCs in some way with your recommendations. That my county, Alamance County, got $330,000 towards the JCPC for maybe even a decade and a half until last year when Raise the Age changed that formula and we finally got a little bit more money. But much like the federal government does when you're giving grant money, you make people jump through certain hoops. And for the feds and cops office, it was community policing, which we'll talk about next. So for us, as we do JCPC funding, why not mandate that every organization have in place racial equity training for the providers of the programs, right? So the people that are running the teen court should have REI in the forefront of their mind. The people who are running the drug rehab, who are running the restitution, who are running the community service programs, all of those folks are sub-actors in the system, and we don't overtly touch them, but we can through the JCPC funding model. So we can really impact racial equity, I think, with those folks through that JCPC lens. And that's really what I have to offer on that topic.
Thank you, sir. Thank you also for leading the way in incorporating racial equities into the grant program. For the members of the work group that aren't really as familiar with the Governor's Crime Commission, the Governor's Crime Commission is comprised of a lot of individuals that are appointed by the governor, members of the General Assembly, and also some ex officio members, and it serves as the chief advisory body, and the Attorney General has a spot on there as well. It is the chief advisory body to the governor and to the Secretary of Public Safety, my position on all things criminal justice. So this is a great opportunity for us to make some crossover and to buy in and maybe some ideas to move various commissions forward into looking at things through this racial equity lens to make it a reality. And then, and whereas I certainly can't promise what the federal government may do, there may be additional funding opportunities as criminal justice reform is not only an issue in North Carolina, but it's a national issue looking at racial equities. And so it is my hope that we can bring additional funding and programming in that area as well. And so with that, and because I want to make sure that we get to the broader topic of community policing, I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Welty to level set us with community policing, and welcome in Mr. True Pettigrew, who I thank you for joining us as well. But I'm going to get Jeff to set the stage for Mr. Pettigrew and to Chief Smythe to share their thoughts and their experiences in the area of community policing, and then open it up to task force members from there on out for the balance until we reach the 3 o'clock hour. Mr. Welty.
Thank you, Secretary Hooks. This turned out, I should say before I say anything about community policing, that if anyone has further comments on the draft recommendations about diversion or reinventing public safety, please feel free to shoot me or Greg an email, and we'd be happy to hear from you in that format. We're going to revise those, and we'll be back for what we hope to be a final discussion and then a vote on them at our next meeting. But with regard to community policing, it's turned out to be a really interesting topic for us as staff to look into. We appreciate our volunteers within the working group that have helped us to explore possible speakers and readings and think about issues to tee up. It's a broad topic. The definition of community policing as a philosophy or an approach as opposed to a set of programs is something that can take a while to get your head around. But in general, it's the concept that law enforcement ought to be working with the community to meet the community's needs, as opposed to something that's sort of separate from the community, coming in from the outside to solve the community's problems. And that kind of led us down a bunch of different pathways. Greg and I probably spoke to half a dozen or more people about community policing from academia, from different backgrounds. Most of them had really interesting things to say. As you know, we sent a ton of readings for this meeting because there's so many different perspectives. But what we ended up with were Mr. True Pettigrew, whose video you saw, who has obviously a very interesting personal story about how he got involved in community policing efforts, right? His background's not in law enforcement, but took an interest in it because of his own personal experiences, and has become somebody who's really a trusted partner for law enforcement in training on community policing. And then Chief Jeff Smythe from the Burlington Police Department, who I think has an equally as interesting a story about his journey in the world of community policing, coming from a big city department out in the Western United States and then coming to Burlington. And he's done some really, really interesting things. So I won't steal his thunder. I know you've seen Mr. Pettigrew's video. I did ask Chief Smythe if he would be willing to talk for 5 or 10 minutes about his background in community policing. So Mr. Chair, if that suits you, to give Chief Smythe the floor for just a few minutes before opening up the discussion to everyone.
Excellent. Thank you. Chief Smythe, the floor is yours, sir.
Yeah, great. Thank you, folks. Again, I'm Jeff Smythe. I'm the police chief in Burlington. I've been here about 7 years. I have about 34 years of experience as a police officer, 27 of that in Arizona. And the bulk of that was spent at the Scottsdale, Arizona Police Department, a very progressive Phoenix suburb, 400 plus officers, very committed in the 90s to community policing. The police chief there wanted to do an 8-hour class on community policing, and I got tapped to create that curriculum and deliver that curriculum to 450 cops, as well as prosecutors and judges and other folks in the city. So I learned a lot in that process. And then in 2008, I took a job in a small mountain town as a police chief, a town of about 10,000 people, 33 cops. And so I went there with this, what I thought was a level of expertise about community policing. And I started to meet with the staff there and teach them what I thought I could teach them. And I was instantly humbled as I met with a commander named Jeff McNeil and an officer named Rodney Hall, and they pointed out McNeil Street, which is where Jeff McNeil's family grew up, 3 decades before, and Rodney Hall Street, that's his family's street. And I learned very quickly that the essence of community policing is that longevity, that ability to connect with your community. And when I was recruited to be the police chief there, it was explained to me that I had to live in town, and the town was split with 2 school districts, and the Show Low School District, I had to have my child in the Show Low School District, and I had to live in that area. And so I learned very quickly the connections that were made when you bump into people in the grocery store, when you attend church with people, when your kids are in class together, and those sort of things happen, right? So now flash to 7 years ago, I arrived here in Burlington, got the lay of the land, and I'll tell you candidly that maybe 10 to 12% of my staff live in Burlington. The vast majority do not reside in Burlington. And so if I were in your shoes, my recommendation is find ways to incentivize moving police officers from their county house into the city house, right? That, years ago we had residence requirements, but those have been struck down all across the country as not lawful to use a force model to get people to live in the community. But if you use a carrot model, whether that's a stipend for residency, reduction in property taxes if you live in the town, or whatever it might be, incentivizing officers to live in the community where they police, to willfully and choose to live in the community where they police, brings remarkable benefits to breaking down barriers, to creating connections that I then see the people around me as people, not as calls for service. And they see me as Jeff Smythe, not as a police officer who shows up in uniform. So the single greatest thing we can do with community policing is not a program, it's not a practice, it's not a form that we fill out. It's creating those relationships in the community. And I think living and working in the same space is the best way to do that. Now, granted, that's not the fit. I see my colleague from Raleigh here, right? So Raleigh's a huge city, and how do you manage that on that kind of scale? That becomes very difficult. It's less difficult in my city, and perhaps a different kind of difficult in really small cities. It comes with exposures. It's not a panacea, but I think that's a wonderful opportunity. The next thing that Mr. Welty and I spoke about the other night just briefly was then, can you do community programs? So when I got to Burlington, I had a community policing unit, the CCAT, Community Crime Abatement Team, 6 officers that worked specific areas. And as I learned about this organization, I would talk to patrol officers and say, okay, so we got this problem in this neighborhood over here. What do you do about that? And they'd say, well, we send it over to the the CCAT team. Everybody I spoke to said, send it to CCAT, send it to CCAT. So I had 125 police officers, 6 of them in CCAT, and 119 officers who completely abdicated any responsibility for community policing because there was a specialty unit that was going to do all of that for them. So I briskly disbanded the CCAT team, sent them back to patrol, and made the statement that everybody in the organization is responsible for community policing, not just a special unit. It was a little short-sighted because the CCAT team was doing remarkable work in the neighborhoods that they were in. And I didn't make the right call for that perspective, but the message that I communicated to the broader organization, I think, was a valid one. And so organizations have to find ways to involve all of their personnel in community policing and not just that special unit. That's another message that I bring forward. And then the last message relates to just my town specifically, something that we found that was helpful. In 2016, we had a very violent, high-profile murder in a city park. And then we had a number of shootings that were kicking off that were retaliatory in nature. And so we identified the players. We tried to get to the table with those players to try to stop the retaliatory nature of what they were doing. And we just didn't have enough trust built up to be able to do that. Then when we turned to some specific community members, and the term we came across was mavens. These mavens are the mothers and grandmothers, and in our case, almost always one that's, so Lydia, her son was killed in gang violence. Ramona, her son committed suicide after gang violence, and Joyce, her grandson was killed in gang and drug violence. So these folks are the core of our community response team. And we now have a group of folks that we can call upon that, you know, Lydia cuts hair in the community. So when we say, you know, Mikey and Robbie are doing whatever, oh, I know Mikey's grandmother, I cut her hair, let me get her at the table. And then they're able to bring forward these people and bring them into a meeting space where we can talk about the violence that's going on and try to derail it ahead of time. So finding those most influential people in the community is kind of the trick to derailing some future acts of violence. So I know I kind of rushed through all that. I'll take a deep breath and then pause, and y'all can ask any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Chief. That was really good. What I'd like to do is if I could get the group just to hold your questions a little bit, because I want to open it up to Mr. Pettigrew to lend any insights and thoughts that he has, because I know this group, including myself, will ask a lot of questions and have commentary, and I want to get Mr. Pettigrew in. He's been patiently waiting, and I thank him as a great part of that community who has been building those bridges all across communities. Mr. Pettigrew?
Yes, hello. Thank you, Secretary Hooks. Hello, and thank you all for allowing me to join in on this session as a visitor. And thank you all for your commitment to doing this important work, and it is extremely important work. I see some familiar faces, so hello to those of you that I know already, and nice to meet you to those of you who I have yet to meet. And I'll start by echoing on I will start by, if anyone had a chance to watch the video that I was requested to produce, I'll start by apologizing for the quality, the poor quality of that video, and that you had to subject yourself to that. But hopefully the content did make an impact. And so I'll start there. But to build on what Chief Smythe, and hello, Chief, good to see you, what Chief Smythe had to say is I think a lot of it does have to do with establishing familiarity when I think of community policing. And it is really about doing life alongside the members of the community. And one of the principles that I learned in the work that I began working with law enforcement is I've heard a number of officers talk about Sir Robert Peel and the philosophies that the police is the community and the community is the police, and really building on that principle that policing is best achieved when it is not something that is done to the community or even for the community. And there are times when those are necessary, and I think we all understand that, but it's best accomplished when it is something that is done with the community, if the community is the police and the police is the community. And to do that, it is really in my experience, the most effective way to do that is taking the time to get to know one another. And Chief, as I listen to you share and having that familiarity of those mavens, having that familiarity of the members of the community, you know their stories. So when you know the stories of the people in the community, what that does is that strengthens your level of empathy. They do not just become other service calls, they become other human beings. And it humanizes the badge for the members of the community when they get to know that officer. And there is revelation that we all want the same thing. We are all here for the same reasons. And we can not accomplish that as much as we have the desire to accomplish that common goal, independent of one another. There are so many, and I caught the tail end of the first portion of this conversation. There are so many social determinants of health, so many social determinants of crime, so many social determinants of violence that are far beyond the ability, as awesome as the men and women of our law enforcement profession are, that is far beyond their ability to ever truly address and resolve. And so understanding that once you have established that familiarity with the members of the community, you all now collaborate and co-create on what are the right ideas and solutions to eliminate the sources of pain that are leading people to the mental health issues that they have, and understanding the best ways to resolve that collectively. What are the sources of crime? And those social determinants are usually discrimination, poverty, education. All of those things are the drivers of that. But when the community members and law enforcement come together and realize that they are one community with the same, aspiring to the same desired outcome, now those levels of empathy that are necessary for any team. I mean, I think we put a lot of emphasis on physical energy and the roles and functions that we play. We put a lot of emphasis on the mental energy. But what I don't think we place enough emphasis on is the emotional energy, the sensitivity, and the empathy that is necessary for any team to strive and achieve great efforts. And when I know your story, Chief, now it develops all three levels of empathy, and there are three levels of empathy that we all share. It's the cognitive empathy, the emotional empathy, and then the compassionate empathy. The cognitive empathy lets me know that, okay, I understand why you think the way that you do. Independent of a relationship, we're going to have those seeds of division that take root and cause us to, all we know is we see things differently, but never understanding why. That emotional empathy helps me to feel your pain and understand why you hurt. That is leading you to behave and maybe feel the way that you do. Now I share in your pain. But the combination of the two leads to that compassionate empathy, which now I am compelled to do something with you to address the source of pain that is driving us both apart, and not only creating our individual traumas in our respective lives, but now it's creating an additional trauma that is driving us apart and putting us at odds, and we're creating more dysfunction, discord, and disarray in our collective lives. So getting to know people on a human level, on a personal level, is really at the core of what I believe effective community policing is about. And so that's my kind of a few minutes. And if you've watched the video and then based on anything that I've had to share now, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, sir. I see that Mr. Wells was able to get on and join us. And so I'd like to give him the opportunity to either ask any questions you'd like of Chief Smythe or Mr. Pettigrew, or any of your thoughts that you'd like to lend to this conversation. And then I'm going to go to Ms. Maxwell and Ms. Wynn after Mr. Wells.
Thank you, and I apologize everyone for being late, but I appreciate the opportunity to join you. I don't have any questions at this point. I'm still catching up a little bit, but I just want to say that, you know, I am very interested in us coming up with some proposals around community policing. It's an area that I have less expertise in, but I think, you know, all the materials that I read, particularly the COPS the first one really just made me think this is a big part of what we're doing here. And so the more we can come up with some concrete proposals out of this, the better. And I'll look forward to hearing from my other task force members, and I will watch the whole video of today so I can catch up and be even more articulate the next time I speak.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Maxwell?
Thank you, Secretary Hooks. Thank you for making the video, Mr. Pettigrew. Unfortunately, during these COVID times, the idea of the barbershop does not lend well. As I'm going out dropping off voting information, most places now by appointment only, and due to COVID with size restrictions, we need to also look at another alternative of engagement for law enforcement with community. I believe already everyone, just like I do, you identify who's that grassroots leader for that community to make that headway within that place, which was not mentioned. And that lends to other things. We've held community meetings within the city in different neighborhoods. And I believe they're about to start back up, which was through a grant because we had gang issues at a time, probably still do. And that lended to help certain communities. And I anticipate more things that I will be able to share with you since my new chief went from a cadet to a chief and grew up in public housing as a single parent. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Ms. Nguyen?
Right now, I don't have any questions. Having said that, I also have seen where like the benefits of community policing, and so I certainly would like to be able to hear some more about this.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Pittman, you've heard Chief Smythe and you've heard Mr. Pettigrew. Any thoughts germinate in your mind that you could offer to the group?
Yes. On the topic of community policing, it is really a touchy situation. And like the chief said, to incentivize officers to live in a particular community that they patrol is actually a brilliant idea. It actually is a brilliant idea, as well as to find these core members. So when me, Jeff, and Greg and Chief Letney had this discussion the other day, we have to have these core members within the community to sit down as liaison between the community as a whole and law enforcement. Right now, community trust of law enforcement is at an all-time low. And so law enforcement will not be able to just pull up to a basketball game and get out their car and play basketball for fear that community members are fearing that they may be killed or either locked up or arrested. So to put these individuals in between who can kind of go to the community or trusted sources in the community, as well as can speak with law enforcement, but yet still hold their integrity and bring issues from law enforcement to the community until that is actually paved to where community and law enforcement can sit down is a brilliant idea as well. We particularly had a couple months ago an initiative to sit down with law enforcement with community members. And to be honest with you, it turned into a mud slanging match. It was particularly pointing the fingers, well, you did this and y'all did this and you. So we didn't have that buffer of going between trusted community members. That is great. But one thing I haven't heard as well is funds to these grassroots organizations that has ties in these communities that could really help community police themselves autonomously outside of law enforcement. So law enforcement do not get involved or do not have to get involved, but yet still keep that relationship with these organizations that are doing the work, especially when it comes in the area of gang prevention. When it comes in the area of gang prevention, you're not going to find too many gang members who are willing to sit down with law enforcement to have any type of conversation. So to have these buffers in place and these grassroots organizations funded to kind of alleviate some of the stressors and some of these killings and crimes, to be frank, would be a great incentive as well. So to fund these grassroots organizations, to create these core members, as the chief said, and to incentivize officers stand in the same areas they patrol, but I'm pretty sure there's many more I think of and sending an email as well.
Thank you, sir. Chief Letney, you have listened to Chief Smythe and his experiences out there, and I know you and your staff have been participants in those community discussions with Mr. Pettigrew, and so I'd like to open it up to you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you, Chief Smythe and True. It's great to not only count you both as colleagues, but as friends, and that I think we all have a similar mindset of how we can best serve our community through relationship and by being involved with and not just around those folks in the areas we serve. So unfortunately, as Chief Smythe said, when the whole concept of community policing started, it became a program, and it should have become a philosophy. I've had the opportunity to sit down and talk with Dr. Lee Brown, who is well known as the father of modern day community policing, when he wrote the book in the 1980s. And I remember going to the class. We all had to go to the community policing class and learn about community policing. I went with my partner and 3 days of training. And I remember at the end of that, he and I were talking and we're saying, this is just good police work. This is about knowing your community. It's about knowing the leaders, knowing the business folks, knowing those folks that you're serving and having a relationship, doing foot patrols, knowing your shopkeepers, being out on foot, even in the middle of the night, in the middle of a snowstorm, if need be. And while it conceptualized it, we were taught in our early days, going back several decades, that this is how you provide a service to people, is with them, not to them, as True has said. So from there, to see all these programs pop up, I've seen in many other departments that had the exact same outcome as Chief Smythe saw, in that it was, the few cops that did it and everybody else didn't. And it has to be a philosophy, and it has to come from the top, and it has to permeate all we do in police service. And as I mentioned, and I think in our small group call with Jeff and Greg and Mr. Pittman, that in Canada, they don't call their law enforcement agencies law enforcement. They call them the police service, because most of what we do is not law enforcement. When you look at our calls for service and compare them against our crimes, on average, most departments do about 10% law enforcement. So there's that little amount of crime compared to all the other stuff we do: quality of life, the problem solving, the helping with issues in neighborhoods, and so on. So some of it is the words, but some of it is really how we focus on building these relationships with everyone in our community, because the public good is public safety. And when everybody's involved in that, and we go back to the Peelian principles we've all talked about a little bit, and that we are part of, but not the only folks to enhance public safety. And there are groups in the community can do that. There are individuals that can do that. And when we partner together, we have a much better outcome. So how we, as a task force, now take this philosophy and try to expand it throughout the state, I think is a great opportunity. But we also need to look at kind of a bigger picture of what community policing is. It's not just the unit. It's not just the officer that goes out to the HOA meetings. There's so much more to it. And there's a lot of great resources and great ideas around the state that we can hopefully come with some collaboration of how we all work together, because relationships do not work when it's one-sided. If we say we want to have a relationship with our community and they don't, it's not going to work. If the relationship, or if our community says that they want to have a relationship with the police and that agency is not open to it, it's not going to work. We've got to be on the same page at the same table.
Thank you, Chief. Both Chief Letney and Chief Smythe lead mid-sized level departments in North Carolina. Sergeant Garton, you're in a larger department. I know you don't speak for the command staff, but you certainly have voice here. And so I want to get your perspective from one of the larger municipalities concerning community-oriented policing and how that translates, at least in your mind, with the cities the size of Raleigh, Durham, Charlotte, Greensboro, Winston-Salem and Fayetteville and the like. Sergeant Gordon.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. When I listen to the breakdown of what community policing really is, it reminds me of my hometown. I'm from a little bitty town in Greensboro, Kentucky, and it's kind of how I've really produced my philosophy in policing. You know, and I train recruits here at the academy, and one of the things I like to focus on a lot is just make yourself likable. And so when we start talking about the city of Raleigh as a whole, you're talking 300,000+ people with another 100,000 here working. So you're talking over 400,000 people on certain days. And then you're talking about, 800 sworn police officers. So you can imagine the call volume. So as I hear the breakdown of community policing, the thing that comes to my mind the most is how this everything that we're doing as a task force is really a big circle that encompasses community policing, because every step that we can take to remove some of those calls for service, the mental health investment, the CAHOOTS models and different things like that start to take away some of the hats that law enforcement has to wear, opens up an opportunity for an officer to spend a little more time engaging someone in the community. But then I think it also has to become, like Chief Letney said, the philosophy, and not just the philosophy of the individual officer, but the philosophy of the department as a whole. And it has to be okay if somebody has to wait a little longer at an accident call because an officer was making the effort to do a better job at community policing. And that sometimes falls to the agency's heads to say that, it's okay for us to spend a little more time. There was a period in time where we didn't take pictures with people. And we've kind of gotten away from that now because people sometimes want to take pictures with police officers. And so we can do those little things. And I think we got to focus on the little things. If we start to, as law enforcement, if we start to focus on those little things that present ourselves as likable, I think the bigger things will take care of themselves. And to Mr. Pittman's point, if you pull up at that basketball court and you're not invited to play that day, pull up again tomorrow. Show up the next day with Gatorade and ice cream. Eventually somebody's gonna pass you the ball and tell you to take a shot. But you have to have the time to do that. And so when I think of it, I think it all has to be done in a manner in which we produce that opportunity and that time for the engagement. And that simply comes with removing some of this undue stress that has been placed on law enforcement agencies as a whole, big or small. And we can't get in the mindset that we're too big to be a community policing organization, because no matter how big the city is or how big the organization is, it is a needed function. And we have to have those bridges, and you can't build those bridges in the middle of a crisis. You have to start building those bridges way before the crisis ever shows up.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that perspective. I know that many of the things we deal with, there's no one size fits all, but I think at the core of it is the human interaction and the valuing of all people in communities, and minorities are a great part of that, as well as individuals with disabilities and different perspectives as well. We are getting closer to the 3 o'clock hour. And so I want to be mindful of that. And so what I would open it up, and you can maybe feed off of some of the information. I hope you will, because it's been very productive for them to be with here, Mr. Pettigrew and Mr. Smythe's interaction with us in our readings, and open it up for some particular solid recommendations that could move us forward, that we could have our substantive staff leads try to pull together for us. So in the broad area of community policing, I want to open it up and solicit your input for some recommendations. And I do see that Jeff has put some information back up here on the screen. And so I'm going to open it up to Jeff or Greg or even Jasmine too, if would like to lead us in trying to fashion some ideas. And so I'll start with you, Mr. Welty.
Greg has shared his screen, and I think he's been tracking the conversation so far and has just kind of put down as potential bullet points some of the things that have been mentioned. That there probably are lots of great ideas that haven't been mentioned, and the fact that there's ideas up there doesn't necessarily mean they're ideas that the group will support, but it's just kind of a way to track the conversation a little bit. I do think it's a challenging area to move beyond generally thinking community policing sounds good into kind of tangibly thinking, what can this working group or the task force recommend to make community policing work better? One thing that I'll just mention for context is I did talk with folks at the Justice Academy. They do offer training in community policing, including a course in community policing and actually a 400-hour certificate program for people who really want to invest in understanding community policing. So it's not to say there isn't more training out there, but there is certainly training available already within the state of North Carolina for officers or agencies that really want to delve into it. But with that, I'm just like everyone else, I'm interested to hear people's ideas and recommendations, and appreciate Greg for keeping track of them.
Thank you. I'd like to go ahead and open it up to our task force members. And I would say something that just came to mind as well. And it's something that Mr. Pittman brought forward as well as Sergeant Garten addressed, is that how do we also encourage law enforcement officers to become greater parts of those communities that we say that we want to serve? I know for me that other than being the Secretary of the Department of Public Safety, I coach basketball in Southeast Raleigh at Garner Road Basketball Club. So I try to get out in the communities no matter how busy I am. And so they may not let me play when I pull up to the court, but they'll certainly let me coach. So how do we incentivize people to get involved where they can get involved with communities as well? But just keep that in mind as you formulate some ideas for our substantive leads to take forward for us. I know this group who has been engaged and intentional as we have. I'm going to chalk that up to a technical difficulty. So I'm going to ask again, does anyone have any additional thoughts? And feel free if we want to think about them. So because I know sometimes that, trying to wrap our arms, and we've had this discussion as a group, and I've had it with Mr. Welty and these, what is community policing? Well, what is it to you? Well, what is it for various communities and things like this? I actually think that these are a great start on there. And so we can build upon some of these that we see here, or because quite frankly, it may not be about reinventing the wheel. The answer and the synergy that is needed may have already been put out there. It's just to get the collaboration to get things moving forward. And then, the elephant in the room is always the funding to get things forward too as well. And so I don't shy away from that element too as far as the discussion. So I invite you to weigh in.
I'm sorry, Mr. Secretary, I know I'm not a task force member, but do I have the opportunity to share some thoughts?
You're honored. Yes, sir.
So, no, well, as I look at this and hear some of the questions that came up about, Kerwin made a valid point about, hey, because trust is already eroded, if you're an officer just going into those communities without a trusted voice of the community, is not going to necessarily bode well. So I think that second point of identifying those trusted liaisons is a critical point, because they exist, they're out there, those trusted voices of the community. But what I would add to that is also make sure that they are trusted voices of the community as well as credible voices of the community. And the distinction that I make is those aren't necessarily one and the same. You can be a trusted voice, but not necessarily be credible on the subject matter. And you can be a credible voice and not necessarily be a trusted voice. So I think it's important that we identify people who are both trusted and credible voices of the community who are seeking to accomplish the greater good of all, because those trusted voices could have an agenda that is going to be destructive. So I think it needs to be a trusted and a credible voice of the community in that regard.
Thank you, sir. Point well taken.
Mr. Secretary?
Yes, sir. Chief?
We have talked in a variety of ways about other topics, and it comes down to, I think what Sergeant Garten said, is this really has to start from the top. To have a philosophy permeate a law enforcement agency, the chief, the sheriff, the director, it has to make it part of the culture. And to that end, as we've talked about with some other things, while the Justice Academy does have some good training and certification programs, there is not a program specifically related to police leaders and police chiefs about this and several other topics. So I would suggest that Justice Academy develop something. We've talked quite a bit about the Chiefs Association and requiring membership, and also requiring new chiefs to go through a training and certification program. And this is, I think, integral to how you lead an organization and the philosophy under which you lead it. So that should be a part of it. I've hired a lot of people from a lot of other departments over the years, and I always ask officers who have experience why they want to come to Apex. And I generally hear things about community and service and so on and so forth. But this one comment from a prospective new officer was very telling. And he said, I really want to be a part of the community. I see what Apex Police Department does in the community. I see your social media. I've been to the events. I see all these things, and it goes on and on and on. And I said, well, you can do that in the agency you're in now. And he said, no, I can't. I'm not allowed to. Matter of fact, I got in trouble because I spent too much time on a call trying to help mediate this problem between neighbors. And I was not allowed the time to do that because there were other calls waiting. And I get that. I understand in very large organizations, because I came from one, you go call to call to call, and you can't spend the time you want or that you think that call deserves. But when we decide as a community how our law enforcement agency is expected to act and react and serve, then with that comes the resources necessary to meet that level of service expectation. And if that means that there needs to be more police officers, so there is more what we call non-directed time, so that officer has time to go back by that basketball court every day until he or she is welcomed in, that's a valuable service. And when we structure a police agency to respond call to call to call, we are not allowing our stated philosophy of community policing to be carried out by the officers who need to do it.
I'll just, I think what Chief Letney's raised are all really good points. And, you know, I, as y'all know, always come back to the school juvenile court partnerships and that sort of relationship. But part of that conversation is really, what is the role of law enforcement within the schools? And that is a particular community. And I think as we think about particular communities, how are law enforcement a part of the community, and or how are they viewed as part of the community, and what's been done to sort of build those relationships versus, you know, in some police, you know, that have been in the news, you know, it's been really clear, you know, and Atlanta struggled with this for a long time and really had to change its whole culture about having outside folks coming in and being officers within Atlanta, and how do you make sure that they're part of the community? And I think I like the idea of some sort of chief training. I think it definitely comes from the top. I think then it also has to come from the community in terms of, you know, how do law enforcement in the community have those interactions? And what I read throughout the materials was the need to develop a community policing plan. And I don't know if we want to make that recommendation. It seems like it almost, as Chief Letney says, needs to come from the top. But that to me is what is sort of the most important thing, is how do you build that culture that you want to be part of the community as opposed to sort of some sort of external force serving the community. And obviously the more local it becomes, the folks are within the community, but they may only be part of one community within that community. And so as we talk about race and law enforcement, you know, sometimes that's the real issue, is that the community may not, the diversity of the community may not be reflected within law enforcement. And so coming up with specific proposals is what I've really struggled here. But I just keep coming back to the school justice partnerships of having those really direct conversations about why is law enforcement in the schools? What are we wanting to do? How do we make sure that they're both part of the schools, but not sort of too much law enforcement getting into the business of the schools? And those are difficult conversations that I think you just have to be explicit about, but it's hard to make proposals on.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
I think it goes back to what Mr. Pettigrew said, is that public safety, law enforcement works best when it's not to the community, not for the community, but with the community. Mr. Pittman, you had something?
Yes, I just wanted to add in right quick that if possible, we could put some type of recommendation into where past indiscretions committed possibly by law enforcement could be recognized within that particular community, and that could be the starting point for healing for that particular community. Some communities, some things has been done that it was unjustly, but yet acknowledgement has not been made from the actual department that may have done these unjust things. And so that will be a big hindrance from building trust. So the recognition of these things and then to move forward from these things will be greatly a first step. As well as I agree with I agree with what Mr. Pettigrew said, but I just want to caution the word of identifying trusted, credible liaisons, because it then boils down to the determinant of who deems them credible within their community. And so we always want to make sure that the community picks who they deem credible to speak for them versus law enforcement deeming them credible or dismissing them for not being credible coming from that community. So we might want to kind of take a look at that as well.
Thank you. I would offer that from all parts of communities with that. When we talk about the idea of truth and reconciliation, we cannot forget about the truth, and that truth is that there have been transgressions by law enforcement. There have been transgressions from members of the community. And so I don't think that you can get to full reconciliation unless there is that recognition by all parties involved. And sometimes that work is hard, but that work is necessary to get us to a brighter spot. We only have just a few minutes left, so I see Chief Smythe has his hand up, and then I'm going to go back to Jeff and Greg to see if you think we're off to a good start or we need additional for today. Chief Smythe?
Yeah, just one quick comment, and that's that sometimes we want to define what community policing is, we can define what it's not, right? So we in law enforcement have some baggage to carry, stop and frisk, zero tolerance policies, right? Let's rule all of those things out. And so define what it's not as we look to define what it is. That might be a strategy that your group can take.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Secretary.
Go ahead, Sergeant Garland.
If I might just add one more thing, and I think this is more toward our agency heads, as we put these plans in place to reduce crime in certain areas, and we plan for raids and stings and different operations, and we target areas of speeding and complaints. I also think we ought to put in place programs, not so much on a large scale, but on a smaller scale, that require officers to go and spend some non-law enforcement time in neighborhoods. Go spend an hour walking around this neighborhood. Go spend an hour trying to find as many kids as you can find to pass out a stick or two. How much non-law enforcement time did you spend in this particular neighborhood or this other? The problem, I think, is simple as it sounds. I think the problem is the majority of folks only see the police when there's an issue. And we've got to get out of this mindset that we can only show up and arrive if somebody calls us. No, we have the freedom and the authority to just go there and present ourselves as likable. It's really that simple in my mind. And I know we need time and there's other ways to get to that. But just as we plan for checkpoints and all these other things, why can't we as organizations plan to just go and spend time in a neighborhood? Addressing broken fences and broken windows. Can we clean up a neighborhood? Can we paint? Can we do something? Can we repair a playground? Something of that nature without it being this grand, big, photo opportunity. No, it's because you care. That's why you're there. And next week or tomorrow or the next shift, somebody else is going to be here because they care. And then the next shift, somebody else is going to be here because they care. And eventually the point will be that we're not just there to enforce laws, but we do in fact care.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Welty, I'm going to let you try to pull us together on any remaining business. I do think we're off to a really good start and that maybe we could have some draft recommendations that could be pushed to the group as well as the voting issues as well. So back to you, Jeff.
Thank you. Yes, these are a lot of really good ideas. I guess the question that I have, and maybe it's for you, Secretary Hooks, is, this is sort of a brainstorming list capturing all the ideas that everybody had. They aren't, many of them might command consensus, I don't know, but we haven't really tested for that. So I'm wondering whether you would like for us to draft up some potential recommendations for you to take a look at, or whether you would like for us to kind of put some very preliminary list like this out to the group for some kind of 1 to 5 assessment of enthusiasm to give us some more guidance on which ones to develop into recommendations. I'm just wondering how to get from this brainstorming list to a list of draft recommendations and have a little bit of a test for consensus.
Right. Well, that you are certainly tracking along with me. I would, if you could develop these into some type of survey mechanisms or just to test the temperature and the pulse of the working group on there, and then maybe we can refine from there for some greater recommendations to the task force. I think that's the best course forward.
Yeah, we can do that. So just for everybody's foreknowledge, then we'll have 2 different surveys, one that is the up or down vote on our finalized recommendations on use of force and SROs, and then we'll have one that is just kind of a test of enthusiasm for a very preliminary list of community policing recommendations that we'll draw on this list to create, and we'll try to get both of those out in the next day or 2.
Thank you, sir. We have approached the 3 o'clock hour, and so I want to thank our guests for being with us. You have certainly added a lot to the discussions. I never want to be remiss and not thank our substantive staff leads, because I know the work that they're putting in with this so that we can get the materials so that these meetings can flow appropriately and so that we can get ideas out on the table to move up to our co-chairs and to the larger task force. And I also know the time that it takes to address and go through these with, but that's not just with me, that's all of us. And whereas we can't create time, we have certainly created energy to move forward. And so I'm thankful. And with that, everybody stay safe, have a blessed day, and look forward to the information coming back around to us. You all have a good afternoon.
Just quick add,
Yes.
You all have in your emails the draft recommendations from Working Group 3, if you all have time to take a look on them and respond to the survey. Thank you.
My apologies really quickly. It's Working Group 4, actually, and there are 2 recommendations. So thanks.
All right. Thank you. I appreciate everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Everybody.